Hello and welcome to Dialogue. For decades, the U.S. engagement in the Middle East, from Iran and Iraq to Afghanistan and Syria, has been called an endless war, no end in sight. But with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, will there be a turning point for peace for the region? What legacy does the U.S. leave behind, and how will its Middle East policy change in the future? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by John Ross, Senior Fellow from the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at the Renmin University of China. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, John.
Hello, nice to be here.
Well, we have been looking at the legacies of the U.S. policy in the Middle East. If you look back at the past 20 plus years, what would you say are the most important legacies of the U.S. in the region?
Well, their policy has been a complete disaster. I mean, it's from every point of view, this is a disaster. Obviously, the most devastating consequences are in the Middle East itself. If you take both policy, after the invasion of Iraq, the bombing of Libya, the civil war in Syria, in which the US was deeply involved, hundreds of thousands more, probably well over 1 million people have died. Several countries have been completely devastated. Libya, for example, which was once the highest, richest country in Africa with the highest per capita GDP, has become a country in which slaves were openly sold. So this is the first disaster. The second disaster is that terrorist organizations, which before the American interventions were very weak, for example, whatever you think of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Al-Qaeda and terrorist forces in Iraq were absolutely insignificant before the American invasion. So jihadist terrorist organizations have become extremely powerful. It has led to the death of, in addition to, say, well over 1 million people in the Middle East, the deaths of thousands of American soldiers. And it's cost the United States hundreds of billions of dollars. It's difficult to think of a policy that's been a more complete failure.
Well, if you look at the issue, the situation from the point of view of human rights, for example, for those who are lucky, I guess, they were not killed. They were forced to be displaced in their country or forced to flee their country as refugees, probably to seek some asylum in other regions, other countries. But as refugees, they are not really, truly cared or loved or taken care of. So they are creating a lot of problems, I would say. From the point of view of human rights, how do you see this situation?
Well, I think it shows that the United States has got a totally false conception of human rights. It declares that the most important human right in the world is something like the question of whether you can use Facebook or not, or certain particular specific forms of democracy. And this is not true. For, as we've seen in the Middle East, for literally hundreds of millions of people, the biggest risk is to stay alive, or if second biggest risk is, you should say, is not to have to flee your country as a refugee. Then you have your infrastructure destroyed or if you take Libya or Iraq, for example, your health service destroyed. So your human rights are completely worse. But the real criteria of human rights is how well is a human being living? What is their life expectancy? What is their health condition? What is their level of education? What is their level of health protection? The United States conception of human rights is absolutely and completely, totally false. And the Middle East is one of the areas which shows this most clearly. It's not the only one, but nevertheless, it's perhaps in many ways the most striking of all. I mean, what is the human rights of the people in Libya who went from a country, as I say, which had a very good health service, which was the richest country per capita in Africa, has now been reduced to a country of permanent civil war, tribal rivalries, in which slaves are openly sold. This is a catastrophic worsening of human rights.
But every time, the U.S. would talk a lot, stress very much about human rights, the values in their foreign policy. Do you think when they started the war, is human rights a factor in their consideration?
No, it's not. I mean, it's the whole concept of human rights held by the United States is completely false. It doesn't correspond to what the majority of the world wants. The majority of the world wants to live a good life, to have the opportunity to do what they want, to be happy, if we want to quote the American Constitution, the right to, the right to the pursuit of happiness. They want to be left alone. They don't want to be interfered with. They don't want to be bombed. They don't want to be invaded. And the United States erects certain totally false conceptions, well, the central thing of human rights, and the United States conception of human rights is totally false, needs to be completely rejected. I know that it's used against China also, but you can see it as just as dramatically, or even worse, because fortunately it can't invade China, but it can invade countries in the Middle East. It's the whole US concept of human rights is completely false from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, if you look at one aspect, I think is often probably overlooked by the international community and reported by the media, is really about the impact of those military conflicts on culture, on civilization. For example, after a few days later, after the U.S. invaded Iraq in the year 2003, the National Museum of that country was pillaged, plundered, and 15,000, I would say, antiquities were looted. So what kind of impact, what kind of loss to Iraq, probably to the Muslim world in terms of culture, in terms of civilization?
Well, I would say it's not even just for the Muslim world. I mean, Iraq is one of the first centers of human civilization, that is, humans living in cities. China, Egypt, and Iraq are the countries in which human civilization originated. So this is a catastrophic loss, not merely even for Iraq. Obviously for Iraq, it's devastating. For the Muslim world, it's terrible, although, of course, Iraq, the origins of Iraqi civilization was not a Muslim country. It only became a Muslim country later. But nevertheless, great artifacts of the Muslim religion have been destroyed. And this is a loss, I would just say this is a loss for the whole of humanity. I mean, from my point of view, the loss of human life is even worse. But the loss for the culture of humankind is absolutely terrible loss.
Mm-hmm. Another aspect, of course, is the U.S. sanctions. Sanctions are important, the U.S. Policy tools against countries like Iran, like Syria, and other countries. Let's focus on Iran, for example. The sanctions have been going on for years. How do the sanctions impact the lives, the economy of Iran? In particular, now, how does it impact the Iranian ability, probably, to handle the COVID-19, for example?
It has very negative consequences because it means it lowers the economic potential of Iran. It cuts off supplies of many goods, and it lowers, therefore, the living standards and therefore the health of the Iranian people. And we know perfectly well that disease strikes hardest at people who are already suffering or whose economic or social conditions are pressed down. So this is very negative. Also, it's an outrageous violation of the international order. After World War II, there was agreement that the body which could impose sanctions, if it wished, was the United Nations Security Council, in which some cases it has imposed sanctions on countries. But the United States has taken upon itself the unilateral right to declare sanctions, which will kill many thousands, many thousands is an underestimate. It will kill at least tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of people by the unilateral actions of the United States. So it's a grave attack on Iran, and it's a grave violation of the international order.
One justification for the U.S., they often talk about is really to spread the democracy, the U.S.-style democracy in this region. For 20 plus years, have you seen any successful sign of U.S.-style democracy in any countries in this region?
Well, no, that leaves aside the question whether American-style democracy is desirable. Anyway, given the problems of the internal of the United States and the domination by billionaires, etc., and the great political divisions in the United States, it's doubtful that imposition of American-style democracy would be a good thing. But anyway, there is no indication of the successful introduction of of American-style democracy into the Middle East. Instead, you have the rise of terrorist organizations, and as I say, horrific situations in countries like Libya. So it's just a joke that what you have is the introduction of American-style democracy, even if it was desirable.
Mm-hmm. Well, another issue related to U.S. military operations is, for example, the Iraq War. It was based on the fake evidence. It was without the UN authorization. And despite the millions of Iraqis, either being killed, injured, or displaced, nobody was held. No U.S. politicians was ever held accountable. And a recent example would be the airstrike, that killed 10 Afghan civilians, including 7 children. And a report of the investigation by Pentagon says it was honest mistake and nobody would be punished. So it gives the sense of there's impunity for the U.S. military, for the U.S. soldiers operating in these regions.
Well, yes, but that's the American conception. If you look at the conditions under which even leave aside even the question of war, I'll come back to that in a minute. If you look at the countries in which the US military is stationed, the US demands that they be exempt from the laws of those countries. Therefore, they are not subject to normal criminal proceedings regarding crimes, and very serious crimes have been committed by American soldiers. There's a terrible situation, for example, in Okinawa, which is part of Japan. But in war, yes, I mean, we know that there have been terrible crimes which have been committed and which have gone unpunished. So this is just a part of this policy. This is a part of the policy of the United States, that the United States demands that it should have a superior status to other countries, whereby it can decide what it wants to do. It decides who it can attack. It decides that its personnel are not subject to the laws of other countries. So it divides the world into 2 groups. There is, instead of having the equality of countries, or so-called democracy, you have a situation whereby the United States demands a superior position for itself compared to all other countries. And of course, this is inevitably, one, deeply destabilizing, and secondly, has horrific results. And we only have to look back at the Vietnam War, where there were the most blatant proven cases of horror, the My Lai massacre, for example, in which in the end, no one suffered significant punishment for things which were completely obviously war crimes.
Well, speaking of war crimes, there used to be an investigation by the prosecutors of the International Criminal Court, but she was threatened by the U.S. government senior officials with the suspension of her visas and the visas of her family members. Of course, after that, finally, the ICC decided to drop the case against the possible war crime by U.S. military and the CIA in Afghanistan. How do you make sense of that decision, of that kind of operation, let's say?
It's part of the United States view. It's the United States sometimes declares its foreign policy as a U.S. exceptionalism. It's not U.S. exceptionalism, it's U.S. supremacism. What the United States says is, our country, the United States, is better than any other country, so we don't have to follow other countries. Well, I don't accept that. My country is different to the United States, but I don't think it's less good than the United States. I know that China is different to the United States, but no self-respecting Chinese person is going to admit or think that China is less good than the United States. I don't think any country in the world should think it's less good than the United States. They're all different. And therefore they have to find ways to interact, and humanity benefits from the fact that they're not all the same. But the United States wants to impose that there are 2 categories of country in the world. One, the United States, which is superior to everybody else. And secondly, the other countries which are inferior to the United States. And this is endlessly going to cause problems and destabilization in the world, because quite rightly, human beings are going to demand to be treated equally. And the United States wants to violate this. And the United States is only 5% of the world's population. And if it goes around declaring itself superior to the other 95% of the population, I mean, Hitler declared that Germany was superior to everybody else, very openly. The United States doesn't openly declare that it's superior to everybody else, but actually acts that way, and in a less brutal way. It does actually say it, and this is a cause of great destabilization in the world, because the other 95% of humanity, quite rightly, is not going to put up with this.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. Coming up next is my earlier interview with Professor Faiz Zaland from Kabul University. We'll be back after a short break. Now joining me is Professor Faiz Zaland from Kabul University, Afghanistan. Welcome to the show, Professor. Well, we are talking about the U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Probably the first thing came to mind would be the wars the U.S. had or have against other countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya. Indeed, America has been called a country of war, as it has been at war in 227 out of its 245 years since 1776. So I wonder, what's your take on that?
Thanks. I think there was a big expectation with the Middle East, this Gulf Spring. The population, youngsters, they were thinking that the Arab Spring will bring a change in the governments, and that change will be for the goodwill of the region and also the population. But unfortunately, with the involvement of US NATO forces, that change has become a chaos. What is happening in Libya, what's happening in Yemen, what happened to Iraq, what's happening in Syria, these are all those humanitarian catastrophes, chaoses which has dealt with thousands and millions of people been displaced, casualties and killed. So US recently, the international relation that US is leading by realism, by war and visions, it has created a lot of devastation. What happened in Korea War and Vietnam, and then Somalia and Balkans, and then now in Afghanistan. These are all those areas where US failed its visions, and it has created a lot of human catastrophes.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, if you take a look at this, the legacy of the U.S. involvement in the Middle East as it shifts its attention to Asia, or some would say they are trying to withdraw from this region, probably it's time to take a look at their legacy. But one of the legacy probably is, the victims of war. That means the civilians, the loss of the lives of civilians. According to one figure, over 387,000 civilians have died violent death as a direct result of wars by the U.S. In the past 20 years, since 9/11, probably 2001. And also, latest case, or recent case, I would say, in Afghanistan, in Kabul, the drone strike. So you see the killing of 10 civilians, including 7 children. I mean, as someone living in Kabul, what's your response to that?
Democracy means respect for people, for the people's wish and their freedoms and rights. But we see with all these invasions and these bombardments and these drones, what happened in Afghanistan and then what happened in Iraq and Syria and Yemen. These are all those big human rights violations that US have committed. I think the court, the Hague Court, the International Court for looking after such kind of violations, should deal with these, and UN, United States, and then Human Rights, United Nations, and then Human Rights Council should look after such cases. In Afghanistan, it is not the only one case in Kabul. There were so many cases in Kandahar and Shindan and Kunal and Host. Such violations happen, and they are like Afghan people are still wishing the international communities, the international organization, that they will look after such cases. Investigation will be there, and those people who committed such crimes, they must be trialed.
Mm-hmm. So the Afghan people are still waiting for answer or for accountability. But if you look at this, I would say, response from the Pentagon, they did investigate the case, and they produced a report. According to the report, it found no violation of law, including the law of war. And then a lot of people expressed their concern that such a report would actually contribute to this sense of impunity, and probably it will contribute to the failure to address the issue of systematic killing of civilians, in particular with the drone strikes, so making, future civilian casualties inevitable. Do you agree with that kind of concern?
Yeah, for sure. Look, if we are making other people, other governments, other nations accountable and responsible for committing crimes against humanity, then how can we ourselves be human violators? How can we be the people who created or who are part of the biggest impunities of the century? So making responsible, for example, in the case of Afghanistan, the Taliban, now they are in the de facto government authorities, making them responsible for human rights. If we, as a country like US or West, they committed the crimes, they are not looking after that. So what are they messaging? What are they messaging to Afghans, the locally, and then to the rest of the world? What the message they are echoing? Such kind of activities and such kind of decisions, such kind of commitments, it really echoes that it doesn't matter to violate the human rights outside of US, but anybody who is committing crimes against Westerns, if that is American or Western country members, then that be a crime. Rest of the world is not a crime if we kill, if we bombard, if we extrajudicially trace them.
But let's focus a little bit on the Iraq war. This destroyed this country on many fronts. There's one figure, after 2003, Iraq's GDP never got back to the level of 1990. And prior to the 1990, 97% of the urban dwellers, 71% of the rural population in Iraq had access to free primary health care. But now, a population of 1.8 million people have to share less than 1,000 hospital beds. And then there's zero accountability about this illegal war against a sovereign country.
Yeah, that's why U.S., NATO, they failed in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's why they received a defeat. What is happening now in Iraq government, what's happening in their parliament, what are they asking? They're asking the very footprint of U.S. should be taken away from the country. What's going on in Iraq, like day-to-day disruption of civil services, day-to-day disruption of the civil economy and all those things, and the infrastructure, it has all gone and ruined. It has all been damaged and destroyed. So that is what the real result is. Like when we say this external state building process is taken lead by US and then their allies, not only in the current 21st century, but also in 20th century, they were all loots, they were all impunities, they were all fake slogans, they were all human rights destructions, they were all catastrophes. So those catastrophes, that history is still there, and we don't see any lesson learned from all these biggest mistakes against human rights.
Mm-hmm. Probably a similar situation, in Afghanistan, of course, 20 years of war. For the involvement of the Middle East of the United States, they talked about planting the seed of democracy, U.S.-style democracy. Do you see that as a successful effort in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Libya, or Afghanistan?
Oh, how can we say that? For example, we don't have democracies there. Second, anything which is copy-pasted, it is a failure. Third, the rights and the values that we impose on people like in Afghanistan or Iraq and Syria, it will never work. What happened in 20 years in Afghanistan, the invasion, it strengthened it, more empowered Taliban rather than Republicans. Now, 20 years, finally they gave all the weapons, the drones, and all these Humvees, the very US M16, M14, and the snipers, and all these weaponaries, and more than billions of dollars weaponaries to Taliban. Taliban were not having any of such weapons and such kind of treasury 20 years before, but US invaded and they left all these very developed ammunitions and weaponry to Taliban. So Taliban become powerful, empowered by the US invasion. The same is happening now in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and Lebanon and those countries where US invaded, and then they empowered the extremists, or they empowered those people that they fought against, or they empowered those structures, authorities that they never believed in democracy. So the democracy has lost its value. The democracy has lost its copy-pasted approach to these countries. Somehow people perceive, generally the nation perceive, that all these values, they are not been respected. They are not the values intrigued in Islamic culture or Afghani culture. The same what we have been hearing and listening to Iraq, and the same thing happens there, imposing a very Western style of living, the very Western style of conducting the civil servants and all these things. But each nation is recognized by its own values, culturally, historically, politically, and then economically. Now imposing such kind of values itself is an invasion. It is itself anti-human rights violation, and it's still a crime. So those crimes have been committed in many of these countries, what we have been referring.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a very good point. You said that every country has its own tradition, its own practice, its own culture. But if you look at the U.S. approach, the foreign policy largely from the West, they would say, oh, there's a universal value. That is democracy, that is freedom. Usually, it's a Western-style democracy. Western-style, you can say, freedoms. Sometimes they would impose those kind of values on countries, on foreign countries. So that kind of practice, of course, produces the problem. Do you see that? That's the problem?
Well, this universal value, the very biggest universal value accepted all over the world in universe is the independence. The independence to live in a country, independence to for having a right of expression, living the way, having its own. When you take off the independence of a country and nation, you actually violate any other values. You violate even the democracy if you take the independence of a country. If there is an independent democratic country and you invade that, you have taken their independence and you have taken their other rights. So with all these invasions, for example, what happened in Afghanistan, Iraq, and what's happening in Syria, the very first right of human being, the independence, that has been taken. So it really violates everything else.
Mm-hmm. Well, overall, if you look back over the past decades, or couple of decades, I would say, of the U.S. engagement in the Middle East, including in your country, of course, what kind of comment you would give to the overall performance of the U.S. policy in this region?
It should be a lesson learned. We should rethink of our international relation. We should value more human rights. We should value more nation rights. We should cooperate on economical basis. We should cooperate on very defined human rights activities rather than invading, copy-pasting, imposing all such rights without thinking about the recipients of it.
Well, thank you, Professor Zaland. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.